Well, good afternoon to everybody who's joined us so far. We're going to just get started now. It looks like a few people are kind of trickling in, but I'm going to go over some housekeeping and we'll let others settle in. But my name is Tommy Johnson. I'm with the Portland Regional Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to today's special event, Food for Thought, What's So Special About Maine Food? The Portland Regional Chamber has been proud to partner with our friends at the University of Maine's Portland Gateway and Office of Innovation and Economic Development to bring you this three-part event series focused on the topic of food. Now, every other week since May 25th through today, on Wednesdays at noon, we've delivered a unique presentation that's focused on the topic of food as it relates to our community. The goal of this series is to help reshape the mindset of how we must continually evolve our understanding and habits through the lens of food utilization. Now, today's topic, What's So Special About Maine Food, will feature three professors from the University of Maine system who will explore this topic. You'll gain insight from thought leaders representing the schools of business and economics to break down this conversation in terms of economics, marketing, and business analytics. Moderating our panel is Pip Speezy, director of the University of Maine Portland Gateway. Like all chamber virtual events, today's presentation is free and it will be recorded and made available for free replay on the chamber's website and YouTube page. To keep up to date on all chamber news and events, visit our website, portlandregion.com. Check out our events page and sign up for our weekly email newsletter while you're there. Now, before we get to today's presentation, I'd like to remind all of you that if you have questions for our panel, please type them in the Zoom chat below, and I can relay them to our presenters at the end of the presentation. Now, at this point, I'd like to introduce you to Pip Speezy. She serves as the director of the University of Maine Portland Gateway, which is a new initiative that provides a dedicated office in Portland to help people and businesses across Maine access the vast array of research and education opportunities at the flagship research university. Prior to accepting the director's position, she served as the principal investigator for the Alaska experimental program to stimulate competitive research. She led and co-created the University of Alaska Fairbanks Visualization Space, which is a high-resolution visual environment designed to enhance shared understanding among circumpolar researchers. I practiced that word. I knew I'd mess it up. Circumpolar researchers, community members, and organizations. Her research focuses now on competencies required to lead large interdisciplinary science teams, and she's worked with dozens of research teams across the country to facilitate the co-development of research collaboration plans. She serves as a founding member of the International Network for the Science of Team Science, a two-term board member for the Arctic Research Consortium, and also as a recently elected member of the Environmental and Energy Technology Council of Maine. Please join me in welcoming Pip Speezy.
Thank you, Tommy. So nice to be here with you today, and happy to represent the University of Maine Gateway here in Portland, where lots of good things are happening, especially thinking about some of the challenges that are facing Maine. So I'm particularly happy to be able to introduce these three amazing people from the University of Maine who are thinking about some of the topics that are most relevant here in Maine, and that's around food. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists now, and then I will hand it over to them to provide today's event. So Dr. Caroline Noblet is an associate professor of economics in the School of Economics at the University of Maine. Caroline is a behavioral economist who focuses on how people use information to make decisions about the natural environment. Her work examines the many factors that impact our natural resource decision-making, including risk perceptions, choice architecture, valuation of the environment, and more. She enjoys working with decision makers and is pleased to be able to conduct her work in the home state of Maine. Dr. Angie Zhang is an associate professor of business analytics in the Maine Business School at the University of Maine. Angie is trained as an economist, and her research focuses on consumer choice and preference, consumer behavior, food marketing, and agribusiness aquaculture business. She designs surveys and experiments to examine consumers' perceptions, attitudes, and valuation for food types and attributes, and understand drivers and factors affecting food choices as they relate to food safety, food security, environmental sustainability, climate change, and the impact of COVID. She has experience in researching and consulting for Maine seafood and marketing strategies. And before joining the University of Maine, Angie worked as an associate professor of economics at the University of Alaska Anchorage and senior risk analyst at JP Morgan Chase & Company. She obtained her PhD in economics and a master's degree in statistics from Washington State University. And Dr. Erin Percival Carter is an assistant professor of marketing at the Maine Business School at the University of Maine. Erin earned her PhD in marketing at the University of Colorado Boulder and trained as a behavioral scientist who uses the tools of social and cognitive psychology and behavioral economics to examine marketplace behaviors. Erin studies consumer judgments and decisions about authenticity, morality, and well-being, and is particularly interested in these evaluations as they relate to agriculture, sustainability, and climate change. Erin also has experience consulting and lobbying in the sustainable food systems and energy spaces. Erin comes from an agricultural background and runs a small farm with her husband and daughters focused on preserving heritage breed livestock and fiber production. In 2020, Erin co-founded the Business, Agriculture, and Rural Development Institute along with Stephanie Welcomer, which they now co-direct. So with those introductions, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Caroline Noblet to take us away.
Great, thanks, Pips. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, everyone, so you can see all of us once again. And many thanks to Angie and Erin for joining as well. So when I think about the type of research that I do as a behavioral environmental economist, what that means is that a majority of the time I'm thinking about the way that people act towards the environment. And we all know, of course, that a healthy environment and a healthy food system go hand in hand. So that's where my interest in food systems came about. So my colleagues, Angie, Erin, and myself are all behavioral scientists. So we use the tools of our respective expertise, which you'll hear more about later, to address these important issues for Maine. And ultimately, behavioral economics has proven that how we present choices to people impacts their decisions. And this is one of my favorite examples of something that we call choice architecture that thinks about the way that we present information to people. And choice architecture is this idea that if goods, services, ideas are presented in different ways, it can help nudge people towards something that either is desirable for them or perhaps desirable for society. And of course, at this time, I should note that different people and entities may have very different ideas about what the desired option may be. So while choice architecture is obviously really important for Homer's waistline and well-being, the question that you're probably asking is, how does this impact Maine foods? So again, as an economist, I think about the characteristics of a good that people are interested in. But I recognize that sometimes people have imperfect information about the products they are buying, which of course limits the ability to match with what they want. And so a question that I ask is there a way we can help nudge people so that they have information that helps align what they want, and maybe in some cases what society wants, with the products and services available? So for example, when you head to the grocery store, right, which we can see a picture of here, to buy some seafood, the primary characteristic that you can find out is the type of seafood, right? Is it salmon or is it a crab? And the price. But is that all that people care about when we think about buying seafood? And of course, the answer is no. For a lot of people, there's really important characteristics like, is it made in the United States? Right? They might be thinking about our seafood deficit, where we import a lot of our seafood from other countries. They might be thinking about the carbon footprint that it takes to fly seafood from various places. A lot of people care a lot if our seafood is made in Maine. They might have a preference for whether that seafood was sustainably harvested. They may also care if the seafood is wild harvest or captured or farm raised. And so what's really important here is not only do we want to match those characteristics that people want with the goods that they're getting, but from society's perspective, we also want to know if people have a willingness to pay a price premium for these characteristics. Because a lot of times the things that we might be looking for example, a certification of that food, that it's organically produced or that it's wild harvested, it's expensive for us to go through that process. And so it's really important for producers to know if consumers are willing to pay for that type of information. So my research team carried out some experiments with Maine and US consumers, both in person and online, to dig down into some of these questions. I gratefully acknowledge funding from the National Science Foundation for this work. you can see one of the 10 stations that were prepared for our in-person consumers, where they were shown seafood products, given information about the different characteristics to see the money that they would spend. And yes, real money was of course involved. And then our online consumers were also given information about seafood products that they could purchase. So what I'm sharing here is a lot, so please give me a moment to walk you through it. But I'm sharing with you the results to show that people really do care about some of these characteristics and that that's important for Maine producers. When you look at the different types of seafood that we looked at, one really important thing to note here is that these are the types of products that Maine aquaculture producers are primarily producing. And so when we look across what people are willing to pay for, we see, for example, oysters. People were willing to pay about 23 cents more per oyster for something that's wild harvested, which is about 13% of the purchase price. They were willing to pay 47 cents more, about 27% of the purchase price for something that was certified, either as sustainably harvested or organically produced. And if it came from their own home state, this was again, US consumer. So if it said it was a Maine product and it was shown to a Maine consumer, they're willing to pay even more. An interesting takeaway here is that these prices that you're seeing for willingness to pay more for wild harvest food are actually substantially lower than what other researchers have found when we start talking about finfish. So if you asked a consumer about their willingness to pay for wild harvest finfish food, that's going to be a lot higher than what you're seeing for these shellfish and seaweed products. And again, that's really important for Maine farmers, aquaculture farmers to know, because that price premium is there for their products. If you're interested in this type of work, on the left-hand side here, I have two articles that my team and I wrote, and I would welcome you, of course, to take a look at them. And so one other sort of thing that I want to share with you is that different information really resonates with different people. And so sometimes labeling information is important, but for other consumers, what's really important is knowing about the larger impact of their purchase on their communities. So in another study, we had consumers make choices after seeing information about the aquaculture industry in Maine, in particular, its value to our economy, including jobs and where those jobs tend to be centered. And so we did find that people were statistically willing to pay additional money for aquaculture products, including support for Maine aquaculture, when they were seeing this type of information, which is of course 100% accurate from a recent work done by the Maine Aquaculture Association and the University of Maine. So in case you wanted to think about something other than seafood for today, I also want to note that one of the benefits of having the University of Maine as a large research institution is to bring together diverse skill sets to address important issues for the state, like PFAS. So many of you have probably seen these types of headlines regarding PFAS in Maine's farms, and therefore possibly in Maine food. And this is leading to some serious concerns from Maine farmers that US consumers are beginning to associate Maine with some unsafe food. And it's a question that the three of us, Erin, Angie, and myself, are going to begin investigating in the coming months through a national survey and choice experiment effort. I have two existing grants with colleagues at the Mitchell Center for Sustainable Solutions focused on PFAS, so I'm happy to talk more about that. And I gratefully acknowledge funding from the US Geological Survey for that work. But together, the three of us want to continue looking at how our expertise in food systems can help Maine with this problem. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Angie Zhang.
Thank you, Caroline. Hi, I'm Angie Zhang, and I'm an applied economist focusing on consumer preferences and choices for food, especially seafood. I study consumers' preferences for different types of food and the characteristics of food, and factors and interventions that influence their choices. While I worked at Alaska before joining UMaine, I look at consumers' preference and market potential for Alaska salmon in China. In the Chinese market, the rising middle class started to show preferences for higher quality food with price premiums. The Norwegian farmed salmon has dominated the Chinese market, while there was little Alaska wild salmon for retail sale. Using an experiment and survey, we estimated that Chinese consumers are willing to pay about $12 more per 500 grams for wild-caught salmon compared to farmed salmon. Chinese consumers showed high intentions to purchase not only salmon fillets, but also salmon heads and bones, which carry low value in the US market. Our models show that consumers' positive perceptions of the clean, safe, and sustainable production environment is the major driver of their high willingness to pay. The results reveal a market potential to expand Alaska wild salmon sale in Chinese market, suggest a sustainable business model, and provide insights into marketing strategies and consumer segmentation. Next slide, please. In another project, we look at consumer preference and market potential for Maine seaweed products. Out of the 5,400 consumers we surveyed, only 36% had eaten seaweed and 64% hadn't. We found very interesting results. Currently, the ways of using seaweed in food are rather limited. Different from other seafood, consumers do not show a strong preference for wild over farmed seaweed. What are the barriers for non-consumers? Unaware of seaweed, taste, and not sure how to prepare them are the top 3 barriers from eating seaweed. What would encourage seaweed consumption? Recipes, easy to use products, fresh product easily available from grocery store, and so on. So consumers' preferences drive the supply side of seaweed products. Developing easy to use products, creating recipes, and teaching consumers are potential strategies for further penetrating the market. Actually, this suggests that maybe we should think in the direction of food reformulation to promote seaweed products. Next slide, please. As Mainers, we are familiar with the topics about North Atlantic right whale entanglement risk and ropeless fishing technology. Ropeless technology is in its infancy. Its cost effectiveness is unknown, but it is a promising technology to reduce whale entanglement risks. To evaluate the feasibility of ropeless technology, one important question to ask from the demand side is, how do US consumers perceive ropeless technology, and are they willing to pay for lobster harvested using ropeless technology? This is an important question because if consumers are willing to pay a premium for lobster harvest using such technology, a share of the premiums gained in sales can be distributed to the stakeholders along the supply chain to cover the cost of investment and marketing efforts. A follow-up question: what types of information may help consumers understand this necessity and influence their willingness to pay for lobster harvested using ropeless technology? Our results show that consumers are willing to pay for lobster harvested using ropeless gear. Some information is more effective than others. Pre-existing attitudes also have an influence on consumers' valuation. Next slide, please. In another project, we studied Chinese consumers' preferences for genetically modified foods. In the experiment, we cooked 4 types of Chinese biscuits using GM or non-GM, China domestically produced or US imported soybean oil for consumers to choose. We split the consumers into 3 groups. First group, no information provided. Second group, we provide scientific information about GM technology to the participants. Third group, we offered consumers a QR code linked to the GM information, and they can decide if to scan it to learn the information. We found that providing consumers with scientific GM information significantly mitigates their aversion to GM soybean oil. Consumers who were more positive toward GM technology chose not to scan the QR code. Those who were more negative toward GM technology chose to scan the code and learn the information. These results indicate that information provision matters. However, whether consumers indeed acquire the information also matters. So we could draw implications if we want to use information to educate consumers to influence their food purchase choices. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn it to Erin.
Thanks, Angie and Caroline. I'm going to spotlight my video here quickly for everybody. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Erin Percival Carter. I'm an assistant professor of marketing. And one of the topics that I'm most interested in understanding are perceptions of well-being, and really thinking through, like, what is it that people mean when they talk about well-being? One area in which perceptions of well-being are quite central, actually, is when we think about food movements and what drives people to consume local food. And Maine has a long and rich history of really prioritizing and investing in its local food system. It's actually one of the reasons why I'm here, even being a kid who went to undergrad in Wyoming and then got my PhD in Colorado. I was familiar even out west with organizations like MAFCA because they're so strong and they've existed for such a long time and have really high quality materials. And like I said, one of the reasons I wound up here in Maine. But even when we think about kind of what people mean when they say terms like well-being, when they're talking about local food systems, it's not always clear what people are talking about. Sometimes it's health. People perceive that there are health benefits, that they'll be healthier if they consume local fresh foods. Sometimes they mean these more kind of abstract notions of well-being. And then even furthermore, sometimes people mean not just their personal well-being as an individual person, but environmental well-being and kind of the well-being of an overall community, which brings me to kind of one of the central issues with studying a concept as important, as weighty as well-being, but also as complicated as well-being, is that we have this growing interest in well-being. We think it's pretty central to what it means to lead a good life, and yet we do not really know what it means, or at least we don't agree on what it means. So one thing that we can do when we're thinking about what does it mean to live a good life is refer to some of these classic models in consumer behavior, the research tradition that I come from. A very common model is this utilitarian versus hedonic distinction. So when we say utilitarian, we mean a product that just like fulfills a purpose. Like, I need to drive a nail in, and so therefore I need a hammer. That's it. It accomplishes the task. Hedonic products are products that fulfill an affective need, a need to like feel relatively more good than bad in a moment. And so we can have one dimension that I'm going to draw from here when we're thinking about well-being, which is this hedonic, affective, momentary happiness kind of definition of well-being. And the actual like state-of-the-art measure for a hedonic measure of well-being over time is to kind of like ping people with measures and say, how good are you feeling right now? And then wait like 5 minutes. How about right now? How good are you feeling right now? And then wait, like 3 hours. How about now? And then, maybe 2 days later, how about now? And you kind of get these like little point measures. You can draw a line connecting all of those points and then just call the area under that curve well-being. The thinking being, well, if people feel relatively more good than bad in all of these different individual snapshot moments, that's like an improvement in well-being, right? It's better to feel good than to feel bad. And so certainly that's one way that you can think about well-being. And that's been a really common way to measure and approach the study of well-being over centuries. And all of these debates go back to like Plato. None of this is new. But in marketing, we've often kind of just left it at that. There is this other kind of well-being though. So if you ask me, Erin, how good do you feel right now? Like, I'm kind of going to stop and do a quick momentary assessment and be like, I'm not super hungry. Like, for once, I'm not cold. I'm always cold. Like, I feel pretty comfortable temperature wise. I'm like talking about my research. That's kind of fun. Like, good, like a 7 out of 10. My kids aren't screaming. Give it time. We're really on a clock right now. So like relatively good. If you ask me something like, Erin, how satisfied are you with your life? Do you feel like your life is meaningful? That's a pretty different assessment, right? And we think that both of those things are related to well-being, but conceptually, it's like over here, right? Now we're talking about this more eudaimonic or cognitive evaluation of life. I'm going to call to mind different things to answer the question, are you satisfied with your life? Do you think it's meaningful? Than I am when I answered this kind of question. And so then as a good marketer, what we're going to want to do is, put these into some now comprehensive model. And we can really just add this meaning dimension over the top. And so now what we still have our utilitarian and hedonic products, this classical distinction that's been in marketing for like 40 years now. And we can also think about products that are really high in meaning, but not necessarily pleasurable, or this top right quadrant, which would be products that are both meaningful and hedonic. I'll give you an example of what I mean here using one of my favorite product categories, which is cheese. So Baby Bell cheese, right? It just like fills a need. It's not the best cheese in the world, but it doesn't make a mess. It's like a great snack size. I can throw it in my purse. And when one of my children or like my puppy needs a snack later, I can give them this thing and they will be satisfied for like 60 to 90 minutes. They're like buying me time and filling a calorie need. It's a very functional product. Then we have something like Pineland Farms ranch curds, which are award-winning and like really deserve every award they're ever going to get. They're delicious. When I am placing an order for groceries and think to myself, who needs a little pick-me-up? Me. I put these in my shopping cart, and I put them in my shopping cart because I know when I get home and I pop one of those in my mouth, for that moment, I'm going to feel just a little bit better because they're very, very delicious. Then we have a product like Walden Fog, which is one of my favorite cheeses from Fuzzy Udder Creamery, one of our local Maine small batch kind of artisan cheese producers. When I eat this cheese, it's a different experience from either of those other two. Like, it's kind of an event. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to like think about cleansing my palate instead of just like throwing ranch curds in my mouth as quickly as possible. I'm going to think about what I'm going to pair it with, or if I even want to pair it with something. Like, as I'm eating it, I'm going to think about discussions that I've had with the farmer and the animals that she raises and the different practices that they're using and how it changes from season to season. And I'm really going to think about all of those things. And that's going to affect the kind of value that I get from consuming a product like that. So this would be a more meaningful product. And the question is like, okay, cool, fun distinction. What does it mean for marketing? How do we actually use this? And we can actually use it in a lot of different ways. I'm going to talk about one more. So I've talked about this distinction where pleasure-based products are relatively more affectively driven, these kind of momentary measures, and meaning-based products are more cognitively driven. And one of the things that kind of is a result of that is that either walking into that consumption experience with a higher level of expertise or supplying your consumers with additional knowledge is much more necessary, much more beneficial for products that consumers are trying to derive meaning from than it is products that consumers are deriving just for pleasure-based reasons. And so we can design consumption experiences that are more likely to satisfy consumer needs depending on which aspect of their well-being is really motivating their behavior and their decision-making at any given time. And I should mention, this is a reference to like a subset of ongoing work with Lawrence Williams, who was one of my advisors and now a great collaborator. And we've been working on all kinds of distinctions with this pleasure versus meaning thing for a number of years now. But one thing that we've been able to do, and this is work with Dr. Stephanie Welcomer, also at the Maine Business School, is think about designing experiences specifically partnering with Maine cheesemakers. So we partnered with the Maine Cheese Guild and thought about, okay, if consumers are consuming cheese and expecting it to be a meaningful experience, what are some things that we could do to improve those experiences for consumers? And one of those things is think about the role that information serves. So measure kind of the benefits of having information, measure consumers' tendency to search for additional information when they're consuming cheese that is more specialty or that they expect is going to be more meaningful. And I'm not going to get into the details of the study. I'm just going to give you the kind of takeaway, which is that when we did this, we found that among these specialty cheeses, consumers' use of, search for, and the value of information was greater for specialty cheeses. And that effect was driven by consumers who were hoping to derive meaning and not necessarily just people who were like, specialty cheese is delicious and fulfills this pleasure need for me. And so I'll leave it at that, as difficult as it is to stop talking about research, and say thank you so much. And thanks to Caroline and Angie for joining me here today. This was fun. And I hope it was a fun reminder for everyone listening in, thinking about kind of the benefits of having a strong public research university like the University of Maine, where we can take this research that sometimes I think seems abstract or removed, and then think about how we can apply it really directly to solving problems and helping institutions in the state of Maine. So looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, everybody. My mouth is watering after the cheese examples. Makes me want to go find some cheese in the refrigerator. And just thanks for this breadth of research that you're all doing. Really interesting to kind of hear about all the different dimensions that you're thinking about. I'd like to just open this up to a very general question. And in thinking about the work that we do at the Portland Gateway, helping to connect businesses with all these resources that we have at the university and vice versa, what advice do you have to people who might own businesses who want to incorporate research into their practice, either in a day-to-day kind of business operation or even kind of planning for the future? And you all gave kind of some great examples of what you're doing now, but do you have specific advice for somebody who would really like to tap into the research that's being done that either you're doing or other people at the university? And maybe I'll start with Caroline, because she hasn't talked for a while.
Because I'm the oldest. Sure. I would say that almost everybody at the University of Maine would be happy to talk with any Maine business that has a question or wanted to speak with us. So for example, the work that Angie and Erin and I are starting together looking at consumer confidence in Maine food related to the PFAS issue came about from a conversation that I had with someone at MOFGA. They happened to just give me a call and say, this is something we're hearing from our farmers. Is anyone that they knew I was working in the PFAS space? So they were sort of like, is anyone working in the PFAS space thinking about that? And so I said, we really hadn't. And so we're happy to sort of pivot and try to address that because that's something that's of interest. I know that Angie and I have both worked with a number of people in our seafood industry. So like the Maine Aquaculture Association, again, if it just gave us a call and sort of said, would you like to work with us on some materials together? Sometimes university researchers might reach out to you and say, we have this idea and we think it'd be really important to target and test, the area that you're working in. Would you like to work with us? So maybe be receptive to those phone calls as well.
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to hear from Erin and Angie on this topic as well. But I think that's one of the reasons that the UMaine Portland Gateway has been stood up recently, in that, to be a conduit between the needs of our communities and the university kind of across the state. So thanks for that plug, Caroline. I think that's a great idea. Erin, you talked a little bit about the specific work that you're doing in the cheese industry, but do you have kind of comments beyond Caroline's initial comments about connecting with businesses and how to incorporate research that's being done into maybe either a startup business or even a business that's been going for a long time that wants to incorporate more research-based information?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really challenging issue from a business perspective. So when I talk to students who are getting ready to graduate and we talk about like, okay, going forward, how should you use the research that we've talked about in this class? It's really hard, I think, from the outside to get perspective on like how solid and how generalizable are individual research findings. And so you can read something in the newspaper and it's like a headline about a study that happened and think, yeah, everything is completely settled and worked out, and this is going to work in my business the same way that it appears to have in that study. And that's not always the case. Like these effects are often more complicated than the press releases might make them seem. And so I think all the more reason to try and partner with or talk to an expert in the space, like a researcher at the University of Maine, and maybe even think about how you could design an actual like rigorous experiment to determine whether or not it's working the way that you think it should work in your business. And maybe it is, but the skill set to make sense of research findings and then test them in your particular context and see whether or not it's working the way you think that it should be working is a pretty specialized skill set. And a lot of that is like language barriers. So A/B testing and UX and all of those things are like experimental design and the kinds of things that we talk about in research. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for partnering that we don't always take advantage of. And yeah, I think that's what I would add on to Caroline's there is be careful applying individual research findings. I guess the other specific thing that I'll add there is when I'm talking to students about making sense of and staying connected with research after they graduate, I always kind of say like, go to a meta-analysis, which is just a study of studies. So if you're really going to do this on your own, like subscribe to trade publications and kind of do that level. If you want to go one level deeper, then you like go to Google Scholar and you Google whatever it is and meta-analysis so that you can get the study of studies and then be a little bit more confident that the thing that you're trying to apply is pretty consistent enough that there have been multiple studies kind of documenting the same kind of effect.
Yeah, that's great advice, both of you. It can be challenging to make those connections, and I think many of us are working really hard especially across the state of Maine, to bring together those opportunities for people in different sectors to learn from each other and really support Maine businesses. Angie, feel free to comment on that question as well in terms of bringing research to businesses, but also just thinking about the market potential research and in developing industries in Maine. Do you have thoughts about the seaweed aquaculture or aquaculture in general in terms of some of the work that you've done in Alaska? What might that look like here in Maine? And do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pips. Actually, talking about applying research in business applications, I have been working at UMaine for 2 years. Actually, I enjoyed every conversation and value every opportunity working with industry stakeholders. So I believe many times, like researchers and industry stakeholders, they have the same problems. So for researchers, they typically start with a research hypothesis that they want to collect data to test. And for the industry folks, they have exactly the same problems they are facing every day in practice. Actually, the conversation between researchers and practitioners actually can kind of bridge the gap for us to understand what has been done, what can be done using the tools that researchers have and the experience the practitioners have to solve the same problems. So I think kind of talking or discussing between the research group and the business practitioners, definitely that's very beneficial. And we all enjoy doing research which is helpful and valuable. For me, I'm an applied economist. I've always wanted to make sure my research is helpful and useful for the industry. I don't want to only focus on theory. I wanted to make sure it's applicable. So I think conversation and kind of co-producing the knowledge, that's definitely very beneficial. The other question, Pips, is about how do I say Maine's aquaculture and seafood. So I am working on a couple of new projects right now to looking at the aquaculture potentials. Actually, Maine unique geographical location and the aquaculture development stage, actually, we have many potentials here. So following up to Caroline's previous research, Finfish versus Shellfish, so they are different. So in a current project, actually, we are kind of splitting the consumer choices between Finfish and Shellfish. We are looking at consumer choices for those two and trying to understand their willingness to pay for US versus imported seafood products, especially talking about seaweed. I got a chance to talk with a few seaweed farmers. They mentioned that a majority of seaweed product is imported at this moment. The US produced is little, and a large number of production is in Maine. So because of that, actually, we do want to understand how consumers view the difference between US versus imported product. and also talking about wild caught versus farmed, because how they value farmed versus wild, that's very important for all the aquaculture farmers. So like salmon, a lot of times people just prefer wild, but logistically, it's not always feasible to ship Alaska wild salmon. It's not all season. So the Atlantic farmed salmon play a role in the market. So that's one story. Another story, seaweed. People do not distinguish wild from farmed. Talking about oyster, how they value a farmed oyster in comparison to farmed, that's another question important to farmers. So if consumers value farmed product, if certain kind of information help them to develop their willingness to pay, then that's helpful for our seafood farmers in Maine.
Yeah, that's, we have both lived in Alaska and lived in Maine, and just both, communities and states that are so rich in this aquaculture and mariculture history, and watching, understanding the culture in each of the states is really, really interesting. And I've been thinking a lot about the possibilities here in Maine. There are so many people, so many smart people working on aquaculture and farming and all those, that burgeoning industry. So it's an exciting place to be, I think, and I think we need people like you all studying it as well. I'm going to pass the mic to Tommy for questions from the audience, and I think he is still there. We go.
Yeah, thanks, Pips. We actually did have a couple questions that just came in. Let me read the first one that I'm going to give you. It's from Jim Hanna, and he says that his organization, Cumberland County Food Security Council, works with recent immigrant communities and has been a strong advocate for increasing access to culturally important foods. They're trying to bridge the gap between Maine local food and nourishing new Mainers with foods they know and grew up with. Any advice on doing this across cultures? And what's the best way to incorporate research practices into day-to-day business operations?
So I will let, would somebody like to jump into that, to a response to that? I know the Mitchell Center has done a little bit of work on topics around this question, but if any of you want to jump in and respond, please feel free.
So maybe I will jump in because myself is an immigrant. So I was born and raised in China. After I came to US, actually, because my professional interest is food research, and myself is also a foodie, so I always think about the food culture in the United States and in China. So here, maybe I should just share my personal experience. So like after living in US for many, many years, I started to realize actually there is always a common ground for food culture. No matter which culture you come from, you can find the common ground, but it takes time for you to realize that. So for example, like we talk about pizza, it's so essential here in US, quick, delicious. So what's the counterpart in China? Actually, I can't find one. So at the very beginning, when I came to US, I never liked the pizza because I didn't understand the way pizza play in the food culture. And until I understand, I realized I started to love it. So this is kind of tied to Aaron's like talk. So basically, when we talk about food, first is like taste, nutrition, food safety, food traceability, but also there is a meaning of food. So I think talking about local foods. So I did a study about local food in Alaska. So the reason people buy local food typically is because it's fresh, because it's higher quality, because they wanted to support local community, because they wanted to help with lower the carbon footprint to contribute to environment. So those are the reasons, like in order people buy local foods. I haven't done anything about local food in Maine. I'm planning to do some interesting research, but going back to Jim's question, I think the reason to buy local food for the US consumers, the Mainers, or the immigrant communities, the same value structure could be developed. So for those communities, maybe to intro them to about the benefit of local food. fresh, higher quality, and our local community. So let them understand the meaning, what local food mean, not only fresh, but also there is an aquaculture community, especially Maine is agriculture state. This is our heritage. So let them understand the local agriculture community. Let them get involved, like the CSA community supported aquaculture, like the farmer market, and understand the culture, why here we have the like, for example, blueberry picking or potatoes, those kind of things. So as long as they gain the understanding of US food culture, Maine food culture, Maine aquaculture community, and also kind of the pride of being Mainers to enjoy local food, I think probably it's helpful for them to combine their food culture to the Maine food culture and to buy local food and support local aquaculture.
Thanks. Thank you, Angie. And I leave it. Oh, Erin, did you want? I saw that you had unmuted. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the other thing I would add is like approaching the issue like without a lot of forethought would be kind of distinguishing between which culturally significant foods are kind of like ritually important and which ones are kind of continuous and important. So if I think about the way that I purchase a turkey for Thanksgiving, right? I, as a consumer, am willing to jump through a lot more hoops and take on a lot more cost in terms of monetary cost and time cost in order to secure a turkey for Thanksgiving than I am other foods that are like culturally important to me, but consistently across the year. For those foods, it needs to be convenient. Like I need to be able to go to Hannaford and pick it up, or go to whatever my grocery store is and pick it up in order to integrate it into my life. And so thinking through if it's, you know, something like access to local like sheep and goat markets for Ide, where it's intermittent, it's not happening all the time, that would be a very different process of putting those kinds of infrastructures in place and getting people in touch directly with farmers, where maybe you could cut out a lot of the supply chain issues that you might have for something like, I'm not an expert in this space, but like I read the thing about green crabs in the Cambodian community in Maine, kind of like finding a niche there. And if that's a food that people want access to more consistently, then it's really about building up an infrastructure to provide access to that food to people more consistently. So that I think would be the first kind of thing that I would try to identify when thinking about culturally significant foods and immigrant communities is how frequently do people want access to this, and how much cost are they as consumers willing to take on in order to secure access? I think you're muted, Pips.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Erin. I mean, I feel like that could be a whole session in and of itself. And it would be, I think it'd be really interesting to bring people together from different cultures to talk about what was important to them and what they need here, or what we need here. We're all part of at least some kind of immigrant community at some level. I think those conversations like that could be really interesting. I certainly don't know enough to understand what the needs are, but thinking, you know, developing an approach with new Mainers, I think would be really interesting. Caroline, one of the questions that kind of has come up recently is this idea of you know, shellfish versus finfish aquaculture. And from your research, is there evidence as to why consumers seem more comfortable with shellfish or sea vegetable aquaculture versus finfish aquaculture? And we, you know, been reading these stories about organizations, businesses that are being, you know, are wanting to do this finfish aquaculture and not finding a home in Maine at the moment. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two different things happening at the same time. So one, from a consumer perspective, in terms of like the product that people are getting, there's been work, not by my team, but by some folks that I know, where they actually gave people sort of blindfolded different shellfish products, and people, you know, blindfolded selected the aquaculture products in part because of the very careful growing environment that aquaculture shellfish products are produced in, that a lot of times they, you know, just the water quality has been tested specifically to grow that type of product there. So on the consumer end, we see some preference for aquaculture products. On the citizen end, which I think is the end that we see a little bit more on the media, there are a number of concerns that people bring forward about producing different types of aquaculture products. So shellfish and seaweed both have ecological benefits to like the ecosystem they're grown in, right? So shellfish are filter feeders, right? So they actually clean the water they're in. Seaweed can often help be a buffer against waves and things like that. So there's some ecological benefits. I'm not as familiar, nor are consumers or citizens as familiar with any benefits associated with from an ecosystem perspective of having finfish be maricultured. So I think that's part of what we found is that people's familiarity with the benefits is very different between those types of products. So I think those two things at the same time, the consumer and the citizen, are meeting together to create this perfect storm, if you will.
Yeah, interesting. Angie, Aaron, any other thoughts to that question? I know Angie, particularly been working in the space as well. So I'll open it up for your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with Caroline just mentioned. And also a little bit to add is that thinking from business end. So finfish, like salmon producer, like in Maine, we know there's a couple of salmon producers. They are large scale salmon producers. And for shellfish, and like oysters or seaweed, typically they are small farmers. So like from business implications, they are very different. So, and also consumers' familiarity, actually, so in a current study, we got a list of seafood, including finfish and shellfish, and ask consumers their familiarity and their like how much they like each of that. So traditionally speaking, actually, salmon is always the top one, and a couple of other finfish. And talking about shellfish, like scallop and like oyster followed. So I think talking about difference from finfish versus shellfish, like Caroline mentioned, the ecological impact, that's one thing, and also the business size. So when we do consumer research, the findings actually, or the topics we should tackle also depending on what kind of implications we want to draw and for whom. So for example, for oyster farmers, actually, because the size of them are very small, typically small farmers, then when we try to understand consumers' preferences, actually, we need to understand the farmer's needs. Mm-hmm. And for salmon fish, because the scale of the business is really large, and we know that sometimes we have kind of a general level understanding needed. But for the smaller farms, specific kind of needs from the farmers. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And another thing is like traditionally, like consumers' consumption habits, like salmon, scallop, those are like traditionally famous things. And also shrimp is another thing. Mm-hmm. But something like oyster or seaweed, especially seaweed, like I just mentioned, probably we need to think about food reformulation. So how to eat them, how to prepare them. So actually I talked about many perspectives, but definitely very interesting and helpful topic.
Yeah, thank you so much. So many things, specific things that, you know, as you're talking, they make sense, but I haven't put together into, you know, a whole package. So yeah, thank you. That's great. Aaron, so I'm just going to say we have just a few more minutes. So if anybody else wants to pose a question in the chat, I have a couple of questions here as well. Tommy, do you have anything from your end, or would you like me to end with one final, or at least one more question on our end?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and ask one more question and then send it back to me before we conclude.
Okay, so Aaron, you had me thinking. You showed this graph with meaning and pleasure, the X and Y axis, and was just thinking about like other foods or things that businesses are promoting, and how does meaning fit into the development of a new food product or something that already exists in terms of marketing, should meaning for that food be an important kind of factor that somebody thinks about, and how do people think about that at the beginning of something?
I think that's a really challenging question when you're thinking about, like, could you design something from the go, intending for it to be meaningful, and then get that to work out. I'm trying to think of like a specific instance that wasn't already tied to some kind of reservoir of meaning, and I'm having a hard time calling something to mind. When we study meaning in our work, we largely think about it in terms of providing some source of connection, and whether that's to like a past or future version of yourself in the most like insular sense, or whether it's connection to kind of other people or other cultures, or kind of a broadening of your mind, like concepts, building out new connections between yourself and the rest of the world is one of the ways that we start to kind of dive into meaning there. But I think you need to have it anchored on something that people can build off of, right? And that's why access to information or targeting consumers who already have some baseline level of expertise turns out to be really important for meaning in a way that it isn't for pleasure. Like, I can just give you a delicious food, ask you if it's delicious, and you'll be like, yeah. And are we going to get some individual differences there? But like, by and large, most people will learn to love pizza. Not everyone, but eventually, like, we'll go, yep, I got it. It might have taken me a while to get there, unless you put pineapple on it. I'm still going to have a hard time with that, right? But like, we'll start to realize, like, yeah, this is pushing evolutionary buttons that are affectively satisfying. Meaning is a little bit more individualized, and one of those reasons is because you need to have some kind of cognitive structure in your mind that you can hang it on in order to then develop these connections. And so whether that's, identifying a target market that already has like that connecting point within the target market, or thinking about introducing the product using analogies where people are now understanding your new product by drawing an analogy to something that they're familiar with that already had some source of meaning. I think you would want that anchor point. But that was a really great question. I wish I had a more thoughtful answer, or like some data to speak to it.
No, that was very thoughtful, and I haven't thought about that intersection of meaning and pleasure in terms of food and marketing and research. So, but it does make me think about all the amazing coffee that we have in Portland, and the moments where I meet people for coffee. Like we do that a lot. Like we have meetings, in coffee shops, and especially during COVID, we would sit outside and have coffee, and I feel like that kind of ritual of meeting over coffee has taken on kind of a different thing for me. Especially since COVID, because we were sitting outside at like 40 degrees.
And I think, just really quickly, because you said coffee, one of my favorite examples of like the importance of getting meaning right, that is relevant to introducing a new campaign, in this case, not a new product, was a coffee company, was Starbucks, actually. So Starbucks at one point several years ago had this campaign called the Race Together campaign, with, I think, the best of intentions, where they said race is this really important issue in America. We as Starbucks, as this progressive company, feel like we can do something to like take one small step to address the problem. And so we're going to introduce this Race Together campaign. And the plan is that Starbucks baristas are going to engage every customer who walks through the door in a small conversation about race while they wait to get their coffee. This is a horrible idea. This is a bad idea that made it through an incredibly well-funded, well-trained marketing department. And part of the reason it's a horrible idea is that conversations about race are really meaningful, are really weighty, and they take time. And so trying to cram that kind of experience into a marketing interaction that has the simultaneous goal of being as quick and efficient as possible. Like, I don't want to spend 3 minutes getting my coffee. I want to spend 30 seconds or less getting my coffee. So trying to cram a weighty, meaningful conversation, even if I want to engage in that conversation into a short like marketing interaction, it's just like a tension that is really going to go poorly. The campaign lasted like 48 hours after they launched it. So lots of things wrong with that, but that's one of them, right? And so really thinking through getting that right, and then designing an experience that's conducive to what people are hoping to get out of it, or what the company is hoping people will get out of it, is really important.
Yeah, I can see that has that would have had lots of challenges from many different directions. Thank you so much for all three of you. I'm going to turn it back to Tommy to close us out.
Well, thank you, Pips and Caroline, Aaron, and Angie, for, again, another interesting and very meaningful presentation. Just a reminder to everybody that today's presentation has been recorded. It'll be available for replay on the Chamber's website and YouTube page. A copy of any of the slides or any additional resources will be included in the post-event email that you'll receive after today. And a quick plug for any other upcoming Chamber events, be sure to check the Chamber website calendar for some great member-hosted events that are happening this summer. Even better, when you're there, sign up for our weekly newsletter. We're going to resume our Chamber events in September with our full roster of signature events, as well as partnered events like today's presentation. Thank you again to our partners at UMaine for this great presentation and for each of the presentations that have been part of this three-part Food for Thought series. Join us again in the fall as we resume our full schedule. And thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, have a wonderful day. Get outside.